At dawn, the rescuers moved along the dry riverbed, their steps slow as they scanned the pale ground for signs of overnight movement. The stillness of the place seemed unbroken until one of them pointed toward a dark shape lying near a cluster of brittle reeds. From a distance, it looked like a fallen boulder, yet the outline suggested something far more troubling. As they drew closer, the shape resolved into the heavy form of an elephant. His entire body pressed unevenly into the dust as though held down by exhaustion rather than rest. A faint rumble escaped his chest, thin and strained, carrying a note of effort that did not belong to sleep. The rescuers paused a few steps back, watching for any sign of aggression or distress. The elephant's ears hung limp, barely twitching at the hum of insects around him. His trunk lay curled toward his foreleg, unmoving, except for a shallow shiver that traveled its length. One of the team whispered, "Easy, boy," though the words fell softly, more habit than attempt at comfort. Step by step, they narrowed the distance, each movement measured so the elephant would sense no threat. The morning light reached his flank, revealing dust caked unevenly across his skin, as though he had rolled weakly in the night, seeking relief from whatever gripped him. His sides rose and fell with an irregular rhythm, each breath a labor rather than a natural cycle. When the team reached a safe distance, they knelt to observe more closely. The ground around him carried deep grooves where he had dragged his hind legs, likely in an effort to rise. But no fresh footprints led away, telling them he had been stranded here for hours. A dry patch of foam clung near the edge of his mouth, catching the attention of the senior ranger. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to the others. "Something's wrong," he murmured. The elephant stirred at the shift of shadows, his eyelids lifting just enough to reveal the dull sheen of distress. His gaze passed over the humans without focus, but the faint rumble sounded again, drawn from a place of discomfort that no one could ignore. One rescuer extended a hand toward the ground, letting the elephant catch his scent on the still air. The animal did not lift his head, but his trunk shifted a fraction, a fragile motion that suggested awareness through the haze of pain. The rangers exchanged quiet glances, each realizing the gravity of the moment. They had seen exhaustion before, and they had seen injury. But the combination of stillness, foam, and irregular breath pointed to something deeper than fatigue. With the sun rising behind them, they prepared to assess the elephant's condition, knowing that every movement needed to be careful, every decision deliberate. Whatever had brought him down left no time for hesitation, yet urgency had to coexist with gentleness. The elephant exhaled sharply, a quiver running along his ribs, and the team felt the weight of responsibility settle into the silence around them. Carefully, they shifted their packs aside and began laying out the basic supplies they might need, unsure yet of how close they could safely approach. The heat had not fully risen, but a faint warmth already touched the sand, promising a harsher hour ahead if they delayed. One ranger wetted a cloth, hoping its scentless dampness might offer a small comfort, while another scanned the area for any signs of recent conflict. Nothing suggested a struggle, only the quiet, troubling truth of an animal brought low by something unseen nearby. By the time the rescuers stepped closer, the elephant's condition had become painfully clear. His legs trembled beneath him in brief, desperate waves, as though his body kept trying to summon strength that simply was not there. Each shudder traveled up through his shoulders and along his spine, leaving him motionless again in the dust. When his trunk shifted, a thin strand of frothy saliva stretched from his mouth to the ground, catching the team's attention with a quiet sense of alarm. He tried to rise once more, gathering his weight beneath him with a slow, determined motion. For a moment it seemed he might succeed, his hind legs folding inward and pushing against the earth, but the strength dissolved just as quickly. His body sank back into the dust with a low, uneven grunt that carried frustration, fear, and exhaustion. One rescuer murmured, "Easy, boy," as if the soft tone might ease the strain clinging to the elephant's labored breath. They observed him closely, noting the subtle tremors that continued to ripple through his limbs. The foam at his mouth had thickened into a pale crust, and his breaths came in short, uneven pulls that lifted his ribs only slightly. These signs drew a quiet, shared understanding among the team. They had seen such symptoms before, low-acting toxins, used in conflicts with wildlife, or left unintentionally in fields where elephants searched for food. The thought settled heavily over them, filling the early morning air with a sense of urgency muted only by their need to move carefully. One ranger crouched near the elephant's head, careful to keep his movements steady and predictable. He set down a small container of water, not forcing it closer, but allowing the scent of moisture to drift toward the weakened giant. The elephant's trunk lifted a fraction, trembling as it hovered above the ground before it fell again, unable to reach. The brief attempt, though unsuccessful, revealed awareness and a fragile willingness to engage. Another rescuer whispered, "We're here," letting the reassurance settle gently between them. The team began preparing to administer fluids and assess the extent of the toxin's effect. But they worked with the patience of those who understood the fine balance between help and harm. Any sudden movement could startle the elephant and push his weakened body into further distress. They approached in slow increments, pausing each time his breathing changed, or a tremor grew stronger. Dust lifted softly under their feet, drifting around them in thin veils, as if the land itself hesitated to disturb the moment. Despite his failing strength, the elephant made one more attempt to rise, pulling his forelegs inward as though gathering whatever power remained in him. His muscles tensed beneath his rough skin, and his body lifted several inches before collapsing once more. The fall sent a dull thud through the ground, and the rescuers felt the vibration beneath their knees. The elephant released a low, trembling rumble, not loud, but filled with the raw strain of a creature fighting an unseen force. It was enough to confirm what they feared, yet hoped to avoid acknowledging aloud. They exchanged a final glance, one shaped by resolve rather than panic. Slow-acting poison left little time, but rushing would only worsen his struggle. They steadied their hands, prepared their equipment, and eased forward with the quiet care reserved for moments when a life hung between endurance and collapse. The elephant's eyes fluttered open once more, dull but watchful, as if recognizing the presence of those who meant no harm. The rescuers paused at the subtle lift of his trunk, allowing him to sense their intention before they moved in to begin the work that could save him. As the team prepared the sedative, a hush settled over the dry riverbed, as though the land itself sensed the delicacy of the moment. The rescuers moved slowly, arranging their supplies within reach. Each gesture measured to avoid startling the weakened elephant. His breaths came in uneven pulls, and his eyelids drooped heavily, yet there was a faint alertness beneath the exhaustion that made them proceed with caution. The plan was simple: calm him, stabilize him, and buy enough time to counter the toxin working steadily through his body. One ranger knelt at his side, speaking in a low voice meant only to reassure. "Just a moment, boy," he murmured, letting the rhythm of his tone become a soft presence rather than a command. The elephant's ear flicked faintly, not in alarm, but in recognition of nearby movement. Dust rose gently around the rescuers as they shifted for better access, the rising sun casting long shapes across the sand. The syringe was prepared, the dose calculated with care, and the ranger reached forward to position himself near the elephant's shoulder. But before the tip could touch his skin, the elephant stirred with surprising clarity. His trunk, which had lain still for so long, lifted slowly from the ground. The motion was weak but intentional, carrying a quiet determination that none of them expected. Instead of recoiling from the team, the trunk extended toward them, gliding across the dust until its tip brushed the earth near the ranger's boots. The contact was so gentle, it barely disturbed the sand, yet it held a weight that made the rescuers freeze. The ranger paused mid-movement, lowering his hand instinctively as the elephant's trunk rested in place. It was not a push, nor an attempt to defend himself. It was something far quieter, an offering of awareness, a signal drawn from the last threads of his strength. The rescuers exchanged uncertain glances. They had seen fear, panic, disorientation, but not this kind of deliberate gesture from an animal in such distress. The elephant let out a soft, trembling rumble, a sound that vibrated through the still air. It lacked urgency, carrying instead a deep, fragile patience, as though he were directing their attention rather than asking for relief. The ranger withdrew the syringe slightly, holding it steady but no longer advancing. A subtle shift in the elephant's gaze guided their own. His eyes, dull yet focused, turned not toward the humans, but toward a patch of tangled brush a short distance away. The rescuers followed the line of his attention, noticing for the first time how fixed it was, how unwavering despite the weakness overtaking him. The gesture of his trunk, the steadying rumble, and the quiet insistence in his posture began forming a pattern none of them could ignore. The ranger closest to him spoke quietly to the others. "He's trying to show us something." The words hung in the stillness, neither dramatic nor speculative. Simply an observation shaped by years spent watching the language of animals unfold through movement and breath. The sedative remained in his hand, but its urgency began to fade beneath the growing certainty that the elephant's plea was not for his own suffering. The team hesitated, feeling the shift in the moment settle fully around them. The elephant's trunk lowered again, slipping back to the dust with slow resignation, yet his gaze did not waver. Whatever strength remained in him had been used to deliver a message, and the rescuers, shaken by its clarity, understood that before they could help him, they needed to understand what he was trying. The rescuers followed the direction of the bull's gaze, moving with the same measured calm they had used around him. His faint grumbles continued, each one quiet but steady, guiding them toward the patch of tangled brush just beyond the riverbed. They exchanged silent looks as they stepped away, carrying with them the weight of a message they didn't fully understand yet, but were determined to respect. The reeds ahead rustled gently in the morning breeze, though the shifting plants carried a subtle rhythm that didn't match the wind alone. When they reached the edge of the thicket, one ranger lifted a hand, signaling the others to stop. The group fell still, listening. For a moment, there was only the whisper of dry leaves sliding against one another. Then, beneath that soft sound, came a faint shuffle-light, uneven, as if made by something small, struggling to remain upright. The rescuers stepped closer, parting the brush with their fingertips, making each movement slow enough to avoid startling whatever hid beneath the brittle shelter. As the branches gave way, they caught sight of a tiny elephant calf crouched in the dim space between the reeds. Its body seemed too small for the wilderness around it, fragile in a way that tightened every breath the rescuers took. Dust clung to its sides in rough patches, and its trunk hung limp. Trembling slightly as it tried to smell the strangers approaching, the calf let out a thin, breathy squeak, barely more than a whisper, filled with fear and overwhelming exhaustion. One ranger knelt slowly and murmured, "Easy now," letting the words float gently across the dry air. The calf stepped back, though its legs wobbled dangerously, and for a moment it looked as though it might collapse. Its sides rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths, showing signs of dehydration and hours of separation. The rescuers exchanged quiet, knowing glances. The bull's earlier gesture now echoed in their minds: the lifted trunk, the deliberate touch to the earth, the unwavering stare. He had been trying to guide them here. They lowered themselves further, keeping their bodies small, their movements predictable. The calf blinked wearily, its head dipping with each breath. One ranger placed a shallow dish of water on the ground, close enough for the calf to sense, but far enough not to pressure it. The smell of moisture drifted toward the young elephant, and after a long, uncertain pause, its trunk lifted a few inches, wavering as though unsure of its own strength. It reached again, trembling, and the tip finally touched the water's surface. The rescuers waited without speaking, as the calf managed a small sip, then another. Each attempt seemed to steady it slightly, though the weakness in its legs remained clear. The group allowed the moment to unfold at its own pace, careful not to intervene more than necessary. When the calf lifted its head again, its eyes drifted past them toward the open riverbed. They turned to follow its gaze. The bull still lay in the dust, motionless, except for the slow rise of his ribs. Yet even from a distance, they saw his ear twitch in response to the calf's faint rumble. The connection between them, fragile as it was, remained unbroken. The rescuers felt the meaning of the bull's plea settle fully upon them. He had used the last of his strength, not to protect himself, but to guide them to the calf he could no longer reach. That understanding shaped their next movements. With renewed purpose, they prepared to support the calf and return to the bull, knowing the trust placed in them was as delicate as the new life trembling in the brush. The light had shifted by the time they brought the father to the treatment area. Quiet patch of open ground softened by late afternoon gold. The sun hovered low, just brushing the tops of the acacia trees, turning the dust into a warm, glowing haze. Every rescuer moved with a strange mixture of urgency and reverence, as if they understood that the giant lying before them had not just asked for help, he had trusted them with something sacred. The father elephant's breaths were shallow, each rise of his ribcage trembling with the poison that still rippled through his body. The tranquilizer had worn off enough for him to lift his head, but exhaustion dragged at him like a physical weight. He blinked slowly at the rescuers moving around him, his gaze lingering on each person, as though memorizing their faces or silently reminding them of the tiny life waiting nearby. The calf, only 20 meters away, tucked in a makeshift shade structure, built from spare tarps and branches. The small elephant lay curled on his side. He had been too dehydrated to stand when they found him. Every attempt had ended in a wobble and collapse. But now, a slow stream of electrolyte solution dripped into his vein, and cool water had been rubbed across his back and behind his ears to bring his body temperature down. His breathing was steadier. His trembling had nearly stopped. One of the rescuers, Amina, crouched beside him, her hand resting lightly on his forehead. She whispered softly nothing he could truly understand, but somehow the tone soothed him. She had been the first to notice the father's strange behavior earlier. The way he'd nudged the air, swayed his head, and groaned low as if begging. Now, looking between the dying father and the recovering calf, the truth hit her again with a force that tightened her chest. He wasn't trying to scare us. He was guiding us. Behind her, the father elephant rumbled, a deep rolling sound that vibrated through the dirt. Weak but unmistakable. A call. A reassurance. A promise that he was still here. "Let's finish the antidote," Dr. Samir said quietly. "He's fighting harder than he should be able to. I think he knows he's close. Close to what he didn't say." No one needed the words. The final syringe was pressed into the IV line. A minute passed. Then 2. Then 10. Slowly, the poison's tight, choking grip seemed to loosen. The father's long, powerful trunk, once limp on the ground, twitched, then lifted. Barely, but enough. A collective breath released from the team. "He's responding," someone whispered. But the father wasn't reaching for them. He was reaching for the calf. Amina stood quickly. "Let him see his baby." They moved as one, carefully disconnecting the calf's line, supporting his tiny body as he tried to stand on shaky legs. He nearly fell twice, but they guided him gently, patiently, step by tiny step, until he was close enough for their trunks to reach. The calf squeaked a soft, frightened cry. The father answered with a low, trembling rumble that seemed to come from the deepest part of him. With effort that made every rescuer stop breathing, he lifted his trunk again, and the two touched. A tiny trunk pressed to a massive one. Weakness against strength. Fear against love. Dust swirled in the quiet air as father and child held that touch, long, slow, unbroken. Words were unnecessary. This was a language older than humans, older than memory itself. A promise spoken without sound. "I found you. I'm here. You're safe now." The calf leaned fully into him, closing his eyes. The father exhaled a long, wavering breath that shook his entire body, then settled. Relief washed through him like cool water. The rescuers stepped back in silence, not because they were done, but because they knew this moment did not belong to them. As the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the horizon, painting the plain in deep amber, the reunited pair stayed pressed together, unmoving except for the gentle rhythm of their breath. Amina wiped her eyes before the others could see. "He asked us for help," she murmured, "and we kept the promise." Behind her, the father's tired eyes closed, his trunk still resting against the calf's. The night carried a quiet peace, the kind that arrives only after life has been given. A second chance.